Jonathan, and welcome to another Trident video. Today, I'll be reading you another article about the war in Ukraine, from a magazine that I have. As I mentioned in the previous video, on May 10th, a staff member in my school gave me 4 issues of the New York Times Upfront, 2 of which contain articles about the war in Ukraine. One of them, the edition from January 9th, 2023, contains the article Children of War, which I have previously read to you. The other one, though, is slightly newer, having been published on March 13th, 2023. Although the front page story is about chatbots, on the top of the cover is a much different phrase: Russia's propaganda schools. This is the title of an article written by Anton Troianovski, and which can be found on pages 14 through 17 of this issue. Considering how closely I follow this war, and how I started up Trident as an anti-propaganda series, I would of course be interested in this article. Therefore, in this video, I'll be reading this article to you. Now, let's begin! March 13th, 2023. The New York Times Upfront. The news magazine for teens. The front page article says, Rise of the Chatbots. However, the article we'll be reading today is Russia's Propaganda Schools. Russia's propaganda schools. Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to whip up support among young people for the war in Ukraine. By Anton Troianovski. Putin talks of students in Kaliningrad on the first day of school, September 2022. Russia at a glance. Population 142 million. The US has 347 million. GDP per capita $28,000. The US has $63,700. Life expectancy 72.4 years. The US has 80.6 years. Source World Factbook CIA. Watch a video The Cold War at upfrontmagazine.com. Russia's propaganda schools. Russian President Vladimir Putin is trying to whip up support among young people for the war in Ukraine. Last March, Irina began noticing strange changes in the Moscow school where she was a 9th grader. A computer class was replaced with a mandatory viewing of a state television report on Ukrainians surrendering to Russian troops and a lecture explaining that only information from official Russian sources was to be trusted. Irina's friends had at first been scared or confused by the war in Ukraine, which began in February 2022. But that began to change. They suddenly started repeating everything after the television, she says. They suddenly started saying that this is all deserved, that this had to happen. They can't even attempt to explain this to me. When Irina, whose last name is being withheld to protect her privacy, challenged her friends about Russian war crimes in Bucha, where many Ukrainian civilians were found dead after Russian troops withdrew, her friends shot back. It's all propaganda. The changes in Irina's school are part of a broad plan launched by President Vladimir Putin to overhaul how students in Russia's 40,000 public schools are taught. Putin has long been trying to consolidate control over education, but the invasion of Ukraine last year has prompted the government to accelerate these plans. The new nationwide education initiatives are part of the Russian government's scramble to indoctrinate children with Putin's militarized and anti-Western version of patriotism, illustrating the reach of his campaign to use the war to further mobilize Russian society and eliminate any possible dissent. Teaching the Kremlin's worldview. Last July, Putin signed into law legislation requiring Russian schools to teach the Kremlin's worldview and promote the government. Students will also now be encouraged to join a patriotic youth organization similar to the one that existed under the Soviet Union. Starting in 1st grade, Russian students must now sit through weekly classes featuring war movies and virtual tours of Crimea, the peninsula in southern Ukraine that Russia seized in 2014 and illegally annexed. They're getting a steady doses of lectures on topics like the geopolitical situation, traditional values, and Russia's rebirth under Putin. The underlying goal of the changes, experts say, is a wholesale reprogramming of Russian society to end 30 years of openness to the West. We need to know how to infect them with our ideology. Senior Kremlin bureaucrat Sergei Novikov recently told thousands of Russian school teachers in an online workshop, "Our ideological work is aimed at changing consciousness." The Kremlin has already jailed or forced into exile just about all activists speaking out against the war in Ukraine. It has criminalized what remains of Russia's independent journalism. It has cracked down on academics, bloggers, and even a hockey player with suspected loyalties. Irina's family has joined the exodus. Her parents didn't want to raise their children in the increasingly militarized environment that Russia has become, so they left for Poland last spring. Changing young minds. While some experts are skeptical that the Kremlin's grand plans will quickly bear fruit, it's clear that the propaganda is already changing the minds of some impressionable youngsters. In the city of Pskov, near the Estonian border, Irina Miliutina, a 30-year-old English teacher, says that the children at her school at first vigorously argued about whether Russia was right or wrong to invade Ukraine and sometimes even came to blows. But in the weeks after the invasion, the government directed her school to hold a series of pro-war propaganda classes, and soon the voices of dissent evaporated. The children scrawled Z's and V's, symbols of support for the war, on chalkboards, desks, and floors. At recess, 5th and 6th graders pretended to be Russian soldiers, Milutina says, and those whom they don't like very much they call Ukrainians. She adds, "The propaganda did its job here." Schools across the country received similar orders, according to activists and Russian news reports. Daniil Ken, the head of an independent teachers union, says teachers have passed along many examples to him. In one class, students are taught about hybrid conflicts being carried out against Russia, with a BBC report about a Russian attack in Ukraine and a statement by President Volodymyr Zelensky presented as examples of fakes meant to sow discord in Russian society. An accompanying quiz teaches students to distrust any opposition activities in their own communities. The decree says that Russian history classes will be required to include several new topics like the rebirth of Russia as a great power in the 21st century, reunification with Crimea, and the special military operation in Ukraine. And Putin's 2 decades in power are to be enshrined in the standard curriculum as a historical turning point. See, is Putin in trouble? Facing page. Schools were directed this year to add an hour of class every Monday promoting the Kremlin's version of patriotism. To mark the March anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, 1st through 7th graders take part in virtual excursions through the Black Sea Peninsula, according to a schedule of the weekly classes posted by the Education Ministry. A session scheduled for October for 5th graders and up was apparently meant to discourage emigration. Its title was, "Happiness is Being Happy at Home." The new push represents an intensification of Putin's years-long effort to militarize Russian society, building on officials' ad hoc efforts after the invasion to convince young people that the war was justified. At a workshop for teachers hosted by the Education Ministry last June, the message to be communicated to students was clear. Patriotism should be the dominant value of our people, according to one Kremlin official. Novikov, the head of the Kremlin's Public Projects Directorate, says that with the invasion of Ukraine, teachers faced a rather urgent task to carry out explanatory work and answer students' difficult questions. While everything is more or less controllable with the younger ones, the older students receive information through a wide variety of channels, he says, acknowledging the government's fears about the internet swaying young people's views. A poll conducted last June by the independent Levada Center found that 36% of Russians ages 18 to 24 opposed the war in Ukraine, compared with 20% of all adults. Patriotism has become a key part of education in Russia. teen members of the Young Army movement practice for Military Parade 2022. In Ukraine, the war has caused vast devastation, but most Russians don't see images like this one showing the destruction in Bucha. Finding ways to resist. Even with all the new directives, propaganda aimed at children remains far more limited than during the Soviet era, a time when young people actively sought out cultural exports smuggled in from the West. Sergei Chernyshov, who runs a private high school in the Siberian city of Novosibirsk, believes the Kremlin's current attempts to sell its militaries into children will also eventually run up against the young mind's common sense. A 10-year-old child is much more of a humanist than the typical Russian citizen, he says. It's simply impossible to explain to a child in plain language why, right now, some people are killing others. As government employees, most teachers have little choice but to comply with the directives, but there are signs of grassroots resistance. Ken says his union has given legal guidance to dozens of teachers who refuse to teach propaganda classes, noting that political agitation in schools is technically illegal under Russian law. In some cases, he says, principals have simply cancelled the classes, knowing they were unpopular. Chernyshov, the school director in Novosibirsk, has resisted the propaganda as much as possible. You just need to find the moral strength not to facilitate evil, he says. If you can't protest against it, at least don't help it. Anton Troianovski covers Russia for the New York Times. Is Putin in trouble? President Vladimir Putin clearly expected a quick victory in Ukraine that would seal his legacy as a great Russian leader. Instead, the war, which is now dragged on for more than a year, has jeopardized his standing. The military mobilization last fall of some 300,000 Russians and recent Ukrainian drone strikes on targets within Russia have made the war real to more Russians. But people are getting tired of it, and Putin knows that a protracted war cannot be popular, says Abbas Galyamov, a political scientist who once wrote speeches for Putin, but has since broken with him. The Russian government hasn't been open with the public about casualties, but in January, American officials estimated the number of killed and wounded Russians at about 200,000. For years, they were told that the Russian army was the strongest and had miracle weapons, but that myth has evaporated. Lev Gudkov, a pollster at the Levada Center in Moscow, recently told Der Spiegel magazine. Despite these signs of trouble, Andrew Weiss, a Russia expert at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, warns that the government's propaganda has been effective and most Russians are willing to accept Putin's leadership. There is no credible indication that Putin is going to pass from the scene anytime soon, Weiss says. Putin is really good at authoritarianism. He's been doing this 20 years and he knows how to stay in power. Patricia Smith. New draftees into the Russian army trained before heading to fight in Ukraine. Troop casualties and criticism about drafting 300,000 soldiers have fed discontent in Russia. Those are the articles, and I'm hoping Weiss is wrong, but we'll see what happens. For now, on to the outro. And now you know a lot more about what goes on inside a classroom in the Russian Federation. In this video, I have read the articles Russia's Propaganda Schools by Anton Troianovski and Is Putin in Trouble by Patricia Smith. Stories like these make me thankful that I am born a citizen of a democratic country. After all, my school does not feed me as much militaristic garbage as the propagandists in Russian classrooms. Also, this article resonated with me in particular since I am myself currently involved in making a documentary about one specific student in these Russian classrooms. As you may imagine, even the art classes are teaching their students to make artwork in support of the Russian military. In response, in April 2022, a then 12-year-old art student named Masha Moskalyova created a drawing in opposition to the war. As a result, in March 2023, her father, Alexei, was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Sentence first, verdict afterwards? Meanwhile, she was returned to her mother, who promised to ward off her politics, anti-propaganda, and drawings. Whether Masha wanted to be returned to her mother is a mystery. I already told you about this in my Operation Blue lecture video, which was filmed in the same classroom I got these magazines in. But I am planning on making a new video to give you more information about this strange situation. By the end of the month I'll present to you the video Masha's Adventures in the Legal Wonderland, or How a Drawing Jailed a Man. After all, this case is so strange it reminded me of an old children's story I once heard. For now, I would like to mention something I noticed about the Trident videos I made in 2023. In Trident episode 8, I mentioned a little girl from Mariupol, Anya Naumenko, who spoke at the rally in Moscow, thanking the Russian military for saving her and the other children.
Спасибо дяде Юре за то, что он меня, мою сестру и сотни тысяч детей спас с Мариуполя. Я чуть-чуть
Some youngsters who thanked the Russian military for... I forget a little. Tell me, George, what did the youngsters thank them for?
For saving them, I guess.
Right, for saving them from their homes. Then I made Operation Blue lecture about Masha, who is another little girl. Then I made these two article videos, both of which are about children. Goodness, the topic keeps returning to children. By Tatiana, patron saint of students. There must be an explanation for this somewhere. With stories like these, I'll continue this series to the end of the war. I hope you found this article informative. If you want to learn more about the current events in Ukraine, stay tuned for Masha's Adventures in a Legal Wonderland. For now, I'm Jonathan Lombardi, and this has been Trident.